Hello, Birds and Language Conference. My name is Jessica Lorraine Williams, and I'm the convening artist and researcher for the artistic project Unseeing Elegy of the Tetrachromats. I'd like to start our presentation by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the unceded land where I live and work. So I live in Geelong, also known as Geelong, here in Victoria, which is on Wadawurrung country. I wish to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and also acknowledge other First Nations people who may be here with us today. As a quick introduction, I'm based at the University of Melbourne Visual Arts Department, and I'm currently completing my PhD in artistic specificities for posthumanism today. So my take on that is through the prism of working with transdisciplinary practices and transdisciplinary practitioners. So as such, this project features a mixed bag assembly spanning art and science. So we have Matt Berg, who is an ecologist, Alex Last, an artist, and Roger Alsop, an artist and academic. Now, in this presentation, you will hear from myself and each of my contributing colleagues giving an overview of their rationale and process in aspects of the collaborative work, Unseeing Elegy of the Tetrachromats. Now, we will conclude with a short summary of findings elucidated from making and conceptualising the project, and the finalised project itself will be available as part of the conference exhibition program online. And I'll share some links at the end for where it can be accessed if you'd like to watch it in its entirety. As a little overview and introduction to the artwork, we really wanted our artwork to be centered on a unifying premise, and that premise was, how might we go about making artwork for birds as the intended spectators of the work? Now, this aligns quite closely with the conference themes of avian aesthetics and speculative approaches to the phenomenological understandings of birds. Now, our project features performance, sound, visuals, and propositions for display and exhibition, all composed specifically to show to an endemic Australian bird, the crimson rosella, Platycercus elegans. Now, we chose rosellas as our focus species because our scientist contributor Matt has been researching them for over a decade. Matt will speak to you next about the auditory and visual complexes of the crimson rosella, which served as a framework of provocations around what is known and unknown in the ecological narrative. As artists, it was up to myself, Roger, and Alex to then speculate on corollary tensions within each of our contributions to the artwork, which included philosophical and more pragmatic difficulties, of which there were a few, inherent in creating art for non-human tastes and perceptions. This was particularly challenging given the absence of readily accessible technologies and institutions of production or display for these viewers. For example, UV light is dangerous to human viewers in high quantities, and monitor flicker rates like what you'd find on the average TV screen or computer screen, they're too low to produce a smooth image for a bird. We were also separated by lockdowns and interstate travel bans throughout our development phase. Overall, we hope to enrich transdisciplinary dialogues around the sensorial lives of birds and also populate spaces between how we perceive the world and how countless others construct and perceive the world around them. This has implications for radical care and empathy with our cohabiting animal athletes, and in broadening understandings of what art and science systems can offer beyond the human, despite, of course, being unable to fully extract our anthropocentric situatedness from within the definitions and parameters of this complex, as we will see.
Hi everybody, my name's Matt Berg. I'm a behavioural and evolutionary ecologist at Deakin Uni in Geelong. In this talk, I just want to give you a brief background about what some of my research entails from my perspective as an ecologist, and the sort of science that the artists have responded to in our presentation. So my field of sensory ecology is all about how animals use their sensory abilities to interact with each other and with their environment. I've been part of a team that's focused on this amongst other topics in crimson rosella since 2004. This is an interesting species to us because it has an incredibly high amount of variability in its plumage coloration for a single species. Ironically, not all crimson rosellas are actually crimson or even red, it turns out. Some populations are dull yellow or patchy orange, or a mix of all of those. In this research, we generally combine field observations and recordings of behaviour and morphology with physiology and genetics. So this field of sensory ecology has moved forward quite substantially in the last few decades, due in part to advances in techniques that can be applied, such as increasingly detailed genomic analyses. One of the real pin-up examples of these advances is our understanding that not only do many birds perceive colours based on ultraviolet wavelengths of light, which are invisible to our eyes, but that their plumage often produces UV colours, again, invisible to us, and that these abilities are often crucial to how they do things like choose mates and camouflage themselves. One of the things that fundamentally sets birds apart from us and other mammals, and which allows them to have this UV sensitive vision, is that they are tetrachromatic. That is, they have 4 types of colour sensing cells or cone cells in their retina. In contrast, humans have 3 types of cone cells, which are the ones sensitive to red, green and blue. And among mammals, only certain rodents and marsupials seem to have UV sensitive vision. We did some work a few years ago where we measured the UV sensitivity of crimson rosellas and other parrot species from around the world. And based on this, we now think that the parrots and cockatoos might be the only broad grouping of birds in which this UV sensitive vision is ubiquitous across all species in the group. Of course, apart from plumage, many objects in nature, such as fruit and flowers, often reflect in UV, and this will produce UV colours to species that are sensitive to it. One interesting approach that researchers have used to study how this might be perceived by birds is by applying sunscreen to plumage. The sunscreen has this really handy property of blocking the UV reflectance from the feathers, but allowing other wavelengths to pass through. So we can artificially create sort of deleted or UV deleted plumage on the birds and then study how they get on subsequently. We haven't used this approach with rosellas, but it has produced some really interesting findings in several other species. In terms of hearing, in many ways, the abilities of parrots and many other birds seem to be relatively similar to our own, at least in terms of the frequencies and amplitudes that they're sensitive to. Of course, parrots are the poster group for one fascinating vocal trait that's actually quite widespread in birds, and that's vocal learning. We know the vocal learning abilities of parrots well through their ability to mimic human words, but in their natural lives it seems to play an important role in social cohesion, and cultural transmission of call dialects can even take place at the scale of specific roosting trees in some wild parrot flocks. In the rosellas, many of the calls they produce are context specific. Certainly some are specific to different populations or localities, and others still even tend to be specific to the individual bird. Anyway, I think that's probably about it from me. Thanks for listening. I hope that gave some useful background, and I hope you enjoy the work that Jess, Alex and Roger have produced.
So for my contribution, I wanted to focus on an intervention into the visual world of our avian audience. And I wanted to specifically modify the UV reflectance of particular objects within the visual field of our bird viewers. I wanted to flip that really familiar trope in contemporary art and in the field of trying to simulate non-human sensory perspectives for the human-centered spectator. In other words, there's a lot in the artistic field that contemplates what animals might see, but what would it mean to show our tetrachromats what humans might see? Primarily, this would mean showing them a reduced visual experience from what they usually see, cutting out UV reflected light through the use of sunscreen applied to objects in a kind of performance. Footage of this performance is what you'll see in our final artwork. Matt and I chose objects that might be of appeal to our rosella audiences: grasses, fruits, and each other, via my stylized drawing here. Hello, Birds and Language Conference. I'm coming to you from hopefully what is the second last day of lockdown here in Victoria. Fingers crossed. I'm actually going to be filming some of the concepts for our artwork with my trusty chicken companions today. They're all about 6 years old because I can't actually get out and show some of these objects to rosellas, which were going to be our intended audience for the artwork. So I'm going to start with chooks today, and then hopefully I can get out into the field over the next couple of weeks and find some rosellas to show my items to. So let's see how this goes. So, much like free drinks and canapes at a gallery opening, to lean so heavily into the anthropocentric reading of this situation, we offered the chooks some culinary benefits to encourage them to attend our performance. And as you can see, Squeak here seemed to be enjoying the free feed and perhaps even some of the spectacle. One of the biggest challenges with making this work, and I discovered in both the first and second phases of my contribution, was to really understand or make an inference as to whether the birds were enjoying the performance, engaged or curious to the spectacle that was occurring outside of the norms for them. One sense I did get was that there was a certain level of consent in being present and wanting to engage and get a free feed, but also keep an eye on the proceedings. At this point, we decide to bring in some chook reinforcements, which adds a layer of urgency to the entire undertaking. Squeak certainly seems keen to devour as much as she possibly can before the bigger chook gets a handle on the food available. We do know that chooks are tetrachromats, but of course, despite their engaging and willing participation, it would seem, by not flying away or having a very adverse reaction to what they were seeing, I still felt like they weren't quite the tetrachromats of choice, especially since we were showing them drawings of rosellas. So I resolved to try and find the real deal out in the field. Okay, so we're off to find some actual rosellas to film the artwork with. We're off to the Great Ocean Road around Lorne and the Wye River area. This is where rosellas normally congregate at feeding sites. So hopefully we'll find some birds who are willing to be spectators for my objects painted with sunscreen. As we headed out, I was thinking about this paradigm that we seem to hold on to around the dichotomy between domesticity and wildness. What would it take to engage a so-called wild bird in a visual performance? Would the birds at the feed sites be so well fed and accustomed to humans they had time to spare for art? A more pragmatic concern that I had was, would rosellas even be there? Turns out they were, thankfully. And in fact, we got far more than we bargained for than just rosellas. This mixed flock was comprised of king parrots, rosellas, cockatoos, and even the odd duck. Given the enthusiasms they had for seeds left by the locals, it was an effort to keep them away from the sunscreen painted objects, our gear, and our personal space. Check out the finalised footage of our filming with rosellas in the finalised piece. And next, we'll hear from Roger and then Alex for their contributions to the artwork.
Now these ones are pretty tame. Thanks for working with us, we appreciate it.
Hi all, thanks very much for this opportunity to talk about the works that we've been making. This that you can see to the left of my image is a translation of Rosella's song into English letters. When I was developing this piece, I went through a number of approaches. One was to slow down the speech of the rosella, and I slowed that down by a factor of 0.001, so it is considerably slower than the original version. And I quite liked that because it allowed me to hear what I thought were relationships between the sounds that the rosellas were making. I then tried to look at ways that I could have that sound be represented visually. The first approach I took was to have the frequencies of the bird song show pixels of an image of a rosella. This was interesting, but didn't really seem to represent the idea that I wanted to express regarding language and birdsong. The second thing I tried to do was have the birdsong frequencies and the onset times between their song set coordinates for geometric designs. That also seemed interesting, but didn't really work. In the end, I decided on the simplest possible approach of making the birdsong into letters of the English alphabet, the one that we are using all the time. And the primary communication that we have, that's what we see to my left. The process was to simply pass the frequencies from their lowest to their highest into the ASCII numbers relating to those lowercase letters, and this is what came about. I liked the idea of having the text slowly disappear, because as we hear things, they reside in our memory, and our memory is notoriously unreliable. Then it fades. The other thing that I liked was keeping this quite low resolution, as I believe the resolution through which we can understand others, particularly other species, is at best poor. These were the ideas that informed the making of this work, and hopefully you're enjoying it. If you have any questions, I can't wait to hear them when it is time for asking questions. Thanks very much.
So this work stems from my immense sort of dissatisfaction with the current ethological literature, and in terms of how it explains the purpose and intent of avian communication. Like across the board, the various explanations that I've seen attributed to bird song and bird calls just feels insufficient and reductive. Initially, the idea was to make a work which might resonate aesthetically with the sensory capacities of the crimson rosella, but I found this incredibly difficult to do justice to. I kept circling back to the fact that we know so little about the species and about birds generally. I wanted to know more about how birds communicate, to get a sense of how they approach and navigate the world, because knowing more about this would then form, a future work, the work which I was unable to create in the first instance. So my solution then is this speculative experimental study aimed at delving deeper into what birds are saying. I should say that I don't have any formal scientific training. I'm sure there's all kinds of missing parts to this study with what I'm proposing, but consider it a draft or a sketch, like a rough idea for how to approach an inquiry into bird speech, which starts from the initial assumption that bird speech is almost infinitely complex and meaningful. So just to help me explain the work, I want to read a sort of abstract which explains the central hypothesis of the study. Okay, here we go. The manifold array of bird calls and songs produced across all avian lineages are captured, segmented, and reduced by ethologists into 4 primary categories, which supposedly explain the purpose and intent of all bird song and call production. These being 1. Territorial demarcation and defense, 2. Mate attraction and sexual solicitation, 3. Contact maintenance between pairs or group members, 4. Predator signaling. We know that birds utilize the complex structure of the avian syrinx to produce an incredible variety of distinctive sounds. Why would such a structure evolve, and why would these distinctive sounds and calls persist and multiply if their meaning was limited only to these 4 broad and overly functionalist categories of explanation? This speculative study hypothesizes that birds, especially highly social birds, including songbirds and parrots, are able to communicate with one another at a far more granular level, exchanging information not simply about what is familiar and common, but also about highly novel events, objects, and environmental changes using a malleable vocabulary comprised of unique acoustic units, which can be arranged and rearranged sequentially for greater communicative depth. So basically, all of this boils down to a conflict between the kind of behavioral reductionism which characterizes so much of avian ethology, and pitting this against an interpretive framework which grants high levels of agency and creativity to birds. I want to cite two theorists that inspired me here and who argue for this openness and malleability. The first is from Raymond Royer's work, The Genesis of Living Forms. We must consider that an animal in a complex, accident-rich environment would have little chance of survival if it could only avail itself of stereotyped movements. Of far greater importance are responses that are improvised directly upon the stimulus, with the stimulus acting as a kind of irritant rather than as a signal. Now, if you take that quote and you replace movements with speech, that's what I'm exploring here. Although movement should play a role in a full analysis of bird communication, because in an even more full version of this work, there would also be cameras rigged around the room to capture all the infinitesimal variations of movement and gesture which birds exhibit, with video data being sent to pattern analysis and movement tracking software. We know that birds rely a lot on body language for communication, so this is probably one of the biggest missing variables in this speculative study. I'm just going to wrap this up by saying thanks for watching. It's been a privilege to be a part of this conference, surrounded by so many interesting voices and ideas. If you know of any studies you think I'd find interesting, please email them to me. Thanks so much.
That brings our presentation to a close. On reflecting on these very disparate creative approaches to the same provocation, we felt we were no nearer to capturing an overarching aesthetic experience for avians, and that there is much more to be negotiated in the attempt to resolve the modalities and expressions of art in the life worlds of birds. Opening a dialogue between art and science enables a plurality of approaches to interface with one another, with all the consequent tensions and exhilarations of doing boundary work that challenges the status quo of particular fields. We're available for your questions now and via email. Thank you very much.